Good morning, everybody. We've closed the door, so I think we should make a start. Thank you for sitting. Thank you for sitting patiently, class. We can begin. Good morning. If we haven't met, I'm James Kirkup. I'm the director of the Social Market Foundation. You are here slightly under false pretenses, because if you read the Fringe Guide, you're probably expecting to see Justine Greening sitting here, and you might have spotted that she's not. However, we're much like we are very lucky not to have Justine Greening. We're very fortunate instead to have Stephen Crabb. Many things. MP for Preseli Pembrokeshire, former Cabinet Minister and member of the Brexit Select Committee. Also got here Anand Menon of UK in a Changing Europe. This event is a joint production between the Social Market Foundation and UK in a Changing Europe. Anand can tell you all about UK in a Changing Europe in a minute. The SMF, if you haven't encountered us before, we are a cross-party think tank based at Westminster, trying to bring about cooperation between parties and policy made on the basis of evidence, not emotion. I'll leave it to you to decide how well that's going. We will. The premise of today was, I think we began with a question, and the Fringe listing you may have seen is, does Britain need a deal with the European Union? So we'll hear in a second from Stephen and then Anand about the case or not for a deal, the need or otherwise for a deal, and then the chances and prospects of getting a deal. But before we start, can I do some audience participation? On our starting essay question, does Britain need a deal with the European Union? If you think that Britain needs a deal with the European Union, that is the most important objective of policy today, would you raise your hand, please?
Before or after Brexit?
There we go. That's the grade A answer.
Smart Alex, stay behind afterwards. Subject to that caveat, at any point in future, or no, let's say before leaving the European Union, does Britain need a deal with the European Union before leaving the European Union? Those in favour of a deal, hand up. No, in the traditions of Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party, I'd say that's unanimous support for a deal. Thank you very much. It's been a very good session. I think we've enjoyed ourselves very much. Good. Well, that's about half an hour. That's a good start. I'll ask you again at the end. See if anybody's changed. So, on which note, I will hand over to Stephen to explain. I don't know, Steve, do we need a deal, Stephen?
We do. But let me tell you what I think the mood is out there in the country, because I've spent a lot of time in the last few weeks on doorsteps in my constituency, as you can imagine. I do monthly Q&A events around my constituency, and similar numbers to the numbers here today, and I did one last week in one of the larger towns in my constituency. And the mood there, if I'd asked that question, and we did have lots of audience participation at that session, but the mood there was overwhelmingly against any kind of deal. And I would say there's been a real shift in mood in the country, particularly outside London, particularly in far-flung places like West Wales, which had voted 54-46 in favour of leave at the referendum, so not very, very Brexity, but the mood has hardened, definitely. And I just think that the whole language around deal, no deal, has, in my view, become contaminated. People see talk of a deal as compromising too far, giving in. They very much identify deal with Theresa May's failed efforts to get us out of the EU. There will be some who will have bought into the if you like, the conspiracy theory that the whole deal setup was a plot on the part of the establishment to keep us tied against our will into EU rule, all of that. And door after door on Saturday morning when I was out there before I came up here early in the weekend, door after door of people I spoke to, people who'd voted Labour, people who'd voted Plaid Cymru in the past, people who'd voted Remain, people who'd voted Leave, obviously, just saying, got to get Brexit done, even if that means no deal. And a lot of them were saying no deal would be best. And my position, and I hope we're not going to end up agreeing too much on the panel this morning, but my consistent position for the last 3 years is that we do need a deal. it's slightly unfortunate, I think, that the word deal has become kind of so infused in this debate, because right at the start, after the referendum, when people talked about a deal, they thought they were talking about the full trade deal. And it became pretty clear, as Theresa May pursued her negotiations, that the deal that was being talked about was not a trade deal at all. It was just literally an exit package to get us out of the door in an orderly way, and crucially into a transition period, essentially a standstill transition period, to provide time to prepare for kind of a real Brexit change. And it is unfortunate that the language around the deal got mixed up in my view. And look, if you had other colleagues of mine on this panel, if you had some members of the ERG here, they would say genuinely they believe that this talk of a deal is a nonsense. Owen Paterson, I'm sure, would say that actually moving out of the EU, fully clean break, he would use language like that, move to WTO trading terms, that is the only real Brexit. And he would stand by that very strongly, but I don't think that's the majority view among Conservative MPs. The purpose around the purpose around the no deal language at the moment, you'll come across a lot of my colleagues who will say, well, we've got to keep no deal on the table. That was Theresa May's big mistake, was because she didn't really seem that she had the appetite to kind of take it right to the wire and threaten no deal. That's why we didn't get the EU side to move in the way that we wanted and give us a better deal. And it was interesting during the leadership race that we had a few months ago, Sajid's view, Jeremy Hunt's view, Boris Johnson's view, obviously, was that we hadn't really tested this notion that by keeping a full no deal on the table, that's the way that you get the best kind of outcome, which is a deal, a good exit deal, and then the pathway to the trade deal that we want. Now, I'll give my personal thought now. I'm a bit sceptical about that whole view. I've lost count of the number of times I've heard people say, well, look, if you go and buy a house, if you don't like the price, if you don't like the terms, if you don't like the condition of the house, you've got the option to walk away. And we haven't shown an appetite to do that, and therefore we're not getting the deal on the table from the EU side. It's not like buying a house. Brexit is not like buying a house. 101 of negotiation is this idea of the BATNA, best alternative to a negotiated agreement. Never go into a negotiation without a clear idea of what the alternative is, your best alternative to a successful negotiation. Well, the status quo currently is not the BATNA in the Brexit negotiation, because we are not going to carry on with the existing terms of our EU membership, which gives us the access that we currently enjoy for our exports into EU markets and everything that comes with it. The alternative to a negotiated agreement is an exit on terms that would be economically worse for the UK, in my view. And I'm not just talking in terms of short-term disruptive impacts of no deal, but the idea that you've taken the biggest step away possible from what we have at the moment, which is full integration, to the biggest step away, which is WTO, no deal terms. So I've always believed that we need to reach some kind of agreement. That I've always believed that Brexit isn't a one-off event. It's a process, and a very long, drawn-out process. It's basically a historic reordering of our relationship with our nearest continental neighbours. And if it's not going to be full membership of the EU, which we've had for the last 40-odd years, and people in 2016 voted very clearly that it shouldn't be that, then what's it going to be? So I'm clear in my mind that no deal is not a stable destination. And the thing we haven't really done as a country in the last 3 years is work out what the destination is. I still don't hear ministers from the top of government being able to spell out very clearly what it is that our relationship long-term, what the new steady state will be for our relationship with the EU, if it isn't going to be full membership. And here we are, 3.5 years on from the referendum, and I think the big missed opportunity on the part of my party, we have the biggest responsibility, having been in government, but also the opposition parties as well, mainly the Labour Party, who say that they're in favour of implementing and honouring the referendum, not really being direct and frank with the British public about the need to spell out and be clear about the destination, what the trade-offs would be, what the compromises would have to be along the way. I remember doing BBC Question Time 5 years ago with Nigel Farage and a few others down in Cardiff, and after they finish filming, they take you off for a few sandwiches or a bite to eat. And it's quite a nice opportunity to mix with the other panellists and have a bit more of a chat. And I'd not met Nigel Farage properly, and he and I were having a chat after Question Time had finished. And I said to him, so what if we do have a referendum and we come out? What would you want to opt back into? What part of the package of our current membership with the EU do you think that it's useful to keep going with? And he said, absolutely none of it. Absolutely none of it. And I said, well, surely that's absurd. So for people like him, they genuinely believe that there is this state of existence where we are completely separate from the EU, where we don't have agreements, we don't have a package of arrangements that involves compromising and sharing institutions or sharing some rules or conventions. But I think that is very much the minority view, and I'm conscious I'm slightly kind of weaving around the topic here, but I'll finish and we'll hand over to Anand now. But my two thoughts coming here this morning were the mood of the country, which Boris Johnson, I think, is reading very well at the moment and has done throughout the summer. And of course, he's helping to feed that, but he has got his finger on the pulse of the country outside London in a way I think no other politician has. But that is not an answer. The rhetoric that we're hearing on the doorstep, I'm clear in my mind, doesn't provide a full answer. We need to work out the long-term bit of the picture, which is our ongoing relationship with the EU once we're out.
Thank you, Stephen. I've been nodding along throughout, and because I agree with an awful lot what you say, and I'm probably going to agree with an awful lot of what Anand says, which is why when we get past the starting remarks, I will then start taking a entirely contrary view to my own and trying to start a fight in the panel, because there is a real danger we have militant agreement here, and that wouldn't be any fun for anybody. So, but with that warning, I'll hand over to Anand Menon. Anand,
thank you, James.
Do we need
Good morning. Well, the first thing I would say is you can tell you're at a Tory conference because no one knocks at Labour conference. They just barge straight in through the door. I mean, this is a very polite conference. There are three options. There have been three options from the start. We either leave with a deal, we leave without a deal, or we don't leave. That's it. They are the only three options on the table. And which you think is better is partly just a matter of what your own preferences and inclinations are. There are trade-offs involved in Brexit, trade-offs between largely economics and politics. If your fundamental priority is sovereignty, you might well think, look, we don't want to be hidebound by other people's rules. We don't want to be in a club where we don't get to say what we want and get it every single time, in which case, fair enough. What is irritating for me, I mean, it goes back to what James was saying about the purpose of the SMF, is we need to have this debate in terms of the facts. We need to be explicit and honest about the trade-offs. There's no point arguing that having a Norway-style relationship will be fine and forgetting the fact that it means submitting to a load of laws over which you have no control whatsoever. Equally, there's no point saying if we are going to be fully free, it will have no impact on our economy, because it will. So the first thing to bear in mind, and in the polarised situation we're in, no one bears this in mind, it seems to me, is that there are trade-offs to be made here. There are costs and benefits. There is no easy outcome to Brexit now. If you take the extreme position on one side, which is no deal, and I'll come back to this in a minute, it will mean economic and other sorts of damage. If we take the Lib Dem extreme, it will have very, very troubling implications for our politics if we were simply to revoke. So there are trade-offs. No deal doesn't mean that we will cease to function as a country. No deal doesn't mean that the government still won't have lots of money to spend. I mean, one of the interesting things about the debate about public spending now, in a way, is that the Conservatives at the moment, it seems to me, are in danger of undermining all the arguments they've made for the last 10 years. Because quite simply borrowing is very, very cheap. It's quite easy to do, and investment is an obvious thing to be trying. And even under a no-deal scenario, it'll impact on costs, but not massively. That will still be possible. We won't run out of money under a no-deal scenario. But it is worth being clear what the impacts of no deal might well be. And here I agree with Stephen that one of the problems with this is the deal metaphor. Because under any normal kind of business deal, if you don't get an agreement, you end up where you were before. With the EU, that is not true. If you don't get a deal, you end up in a very, very different place to where you were before, because all those rules that govern how we trade, how we travel, how we cooperate on security, simply cease to apply to us from the moment we leave. And that has implications. It has implications on ports, it has implications on our ability to trade. It means that we're very, very dependent, and this is not a position anyone should want to be in, on the goodwill of the French, with apologies to the French at the back of the room, to allow things to pass through Calais. And way beyond the economics, not talked about enough, I don't think, if we leave with no deal, we lose things like access to EU criminal databases immediately. Not only do we lose access to those databases, but we are forced by law to delete any data that we've had from those databases. So if the police are engaged in an ongoing investigation of a suspect based on information from EU databases, on Brexit Day +1, they have to delete all that information because we're in breach of EU data privacy laws by holding on to it as a non-member state. That has implications. I mean, it's not beyond the realms of possibility. If you happen to run a criminal gang on mainland Europe and you think, how do we disappear from the radar? Well, you cross the channel. Because the radar ceases to exist on our side of the channel once we've left with no deal. That's not scaremongering, that's simply the law. We will face legal proceedings if we do not comply with that part of the law. So, and the final thing I say about no deal, and the final sort of...
Sorry, can I very politely ask you to wait until the...
It is absolutely...
we will have a conversation, I promise. I just very much like everyone to be polite and wait until others have finished speaking, if that's okay.
Let me just say, yeah, I mean, we'll come back to it, but yes, I do seriously think that, and if you ask any lawyer involved with any police force in the country, they will confirm that that's true. But we could talk about that afterwards. The bottom line, I mean, James has written about this very well as well, is it is important not to think that a no-deal Brexit is going to be clean. It will be messy. Doesn't mean there aren't reasons to want it if you just want this whole thing out of the way and you're fed up of dealing with the European Union, but it will be messy, and it will be messy because it will require us to adjust in some quite significant ways on Brexit Day +1. We can come back to this. So I worry about the just get it done because I worry that no deal isn't getting it done. It is simply storing up a far messier negotiation for the future because remember, if we go back to the European Union after a no-deal outcome and say, let's talk about the future, the first thing they will say is, absolutely, let's talk about the future. But before we do so, we would like a little conversation about the Brexit bill, the Northern Ireland border, and citizens' rights. And once we've ticked those boxes, we can talk about the future. The problem is, once you're outside of Article 50, dealing with those issues will require parliamentary ratification in every single one of the 27 member states, and whether you like that or not, it'll take a long, long time. And I'd rather not have our negotiations on citizens' rights with the European Union dependent on a majority vote in the Polish Parliament, which is what will happen outside of the Article 50 framework. Stephen was absolutely right, and I'll finish on this, that neither side has covered themselves in glory in terms of thinking about the end state. We haven't had a clear enough discussion over the sort of relationship we ultimately want with the European Union. The European Union is incapable of having that sort of discussion because the European Union always approaches negotiations like this from the point of view of what does the rule book say. It is staggering the degree to which no one in Brussels has sat down and said, here is one of our most important partners in terms of trade, in terms of security. We need to have a close relationship with them. How do we go from where we are now to that sort of close relationship? What sort of flexibility can we show? The European Union, historically, in any negotiations it's had with any non-member partner, has sat down and said, these be the rules, comply with them or else. So this isn't a question of saying one side has performed worse than the other. I think both sides have performed pretty damn badly in these negotiations, but ultimately what we have to have, sooner rather than later in my book, is a serious conversation about what is a very important relationship for both sides of the Channel, and on the basis of that try and create some sort of deal which would be easier to do under Article 50, though not impossible outside, so that moving forward we can continue to collaborate within the constraints imposed by their law and our politics. And I don't think that should be beyond the wit of man.
Thank you. Now, before we get some questions and thoughts from the audience, I'm going to ask you both a question, and I should, before I do that, confirm I'm also in favour of a deal, and I have another life writing columns for newspapers now and again. I've written quite a lot about the case for various deals, including even Theresa May's deal. But having said that I'm in favour of a deal, I'm now going to try and put a question based coming from the opposite view. You've both said that you both mentioned trade-offs. You both said that it has not been clearly put to the electorate that there is a trade-off involved in all these options, that you can either have economic integration at a cost of giving up control over your various bits of policy, whether it's food standards, whether it's investment, whatever it is, or you can have the joy of freedom at economic cost. But surely, wasn't that put very clearly to the electorate in 2016? The entire referendum campaign was framed as you can choose membership and economic advantage, or you can choose to leave at economic cost. And the majority of the electorate, bluntly, to use a phrase used by Philip Hammond and others, the electorate voted to be poorer. That was a conscious choice. It was put to the British people that if you leave the European Union, you might be a bit poorer, and the British people said, okay, fine, that's a price we're prepared to pay. And actually, people in politics vote all the time to be poorer. We regularly choose to assign greater value to things other than economic growth because we consider them to be more important. If we wanted to absolutely maximise economic growth above all else, we would pursue a very different sort of politics and a very different policy mix. So isn't it the case that there is a very strong mandate for leaving with no deal because the British people were asked what was most important to them, and they said that the thing that was most important to them was absolute control, total sovereign control over policy, and therefore it makes sense for the government of the day to prioritise above all else leaving the European Union, come what may.
Do you want to go? You're right up to a point, and to give Nigel Farage his due, I remember during the referendum campaign him being pressed on the radio about the fact that cutting immigration would have negative economic impacts on our country, and his response was, there are some things that are more important than money. So yes, some people were explicit about the trade-offs, and equally, yes, it is absolutely the case that a significant proportion of leavers in all the polling that has been done say they are willing to take a degree of economic pain in order to get Brexit done. You've got to dig into those numbers a little bit. There is a variety. There is a straightforward, yep, I don't care if it makes me poorer, that's fine, I want this done. There are those who say, actually, I don't believe you. That is to say, that's the Project Fear argument, as in I simply will not accept that this will make me poorer, so just get it done. And there are others still who would say, well, look, while George Osborne was telling me the economy was growing, my life was getting worse. So if after Brexit the economy starts shrinking, I don't see why it will make that much of a substantive difference to me. So there are lots of different sorts of willingnesses to tolerate economic pain bundled up in this. But nevertheless, during the referendum campaign, there were significant numbers of voices on the Leave side who strongly implied that you could leave the European Union and the economics would remain broadly the same. And that is what we need to be clear about, is that if you are willing to take economic pain to get this done, absolutely fair enough, I respect your opinion, and it is a perfectly valid opinion. You cannot argue, and remember the arguments about the German car makers falling over themselves to give us a deal that would be the same as the deal we had even if we left because they rely on us more than we rely on them. That is what hasn't come to pass. So I think in that sense, at least, the argument doesn't hold true.
Did people voluntarily, knowingly, willingly vote to be poorer?
Well, I asked that question at my public Q&A event last week. No, I didn't actually. It was somebody from the floor stood up and said that we didn't vote to become poorer. And he was shouted down in that meeting by everyone else who was there. Not that they're saying, yes, we want to be poor, but saying it wasn't about economics. And you hear that time and time again. And that's what, if I'm honest, people like myself who, I was part of David Cameron's team at the time and very much involved with some of his Remain campaign planning meetings. And we'd sit around with George Osborne and some of the other advisors, and we had these long-range Treasury forecasts that had been cooked up. And during that referendum campaign, it was almost like two different languages were being spoken. There was the language of economics and trade and relative gain or loss, depending on different types of scenario at the end of it. And actually, for most people up and down the country, it wasn't racism, it wasn't immigration, it was just that pure feeling of we want to be in control of our destiny. And the Leave campaign won by sounding more optimistic, more patriotic, and sounding like they believed in Britain. And people responded to that. And as I said in my opening remarks, I still think people are largely in that place, and even more wanting to see their vote honoured and upheld. And I did a tweet about this on Saturday after I'd been out on the doors. I think for most people now, when you talk to them on the doorsteps, it's about honouring democracy, pure and simple. Do you value the vote that we took or not? And it's almost that the economic arguments, I agree with Anand, either they don't believe them, they may not feel that they have enough information to properly grapple with the arguments about the impact on Welsh farming or UK oil refining and all of these other very individual issues that will be impacted by no deal. But for most people, it's about sovereignty and democracy. Take back control. The most powerful line in the referendum.
I mean, it's just worth adding a couple of things. In one absolutely fundamental sense, the case for leaving now is significantly stronger than the case for leaving was before the referendum, and that's simply because we voted to. I think we forget that sometimes. I mean, there is a far more compelling case for leaving now than there was before June 2016, because we've had a referendum, we voted to leave. The second thing that's worth saying, which kind of goes in the same direction as people being willing to tolerate economic pain, is that virtually no one has changed their mind. I know that the polls have swung, so the poll of polls, the aggregate polling now, I think, is about 53-47 in favour of Remain, which is actually where it was just before the referendum, if you believe most pollsters. But that shift is almost entirely made up of people who either didn't vote or couldn't vote in 2016 now saying they'd vote Remain. There is very, very little evidence of people on either side of this debate having changed their minds. And that has to be worth something, I think, in terms of how we think about what people are thinking about this.
Now, before we, actually, can I steal one more question of you both, if I may, before we go to thoughts from the audience? I think both of you again alluded to this question of the what next question, the future relationship. Stephen, you said we haven't heard enough about what the vision for post-EU Britain is. There was a brief point last year, a couple of years ago, we heard a little bit about Singapore on Thames, a sort of a particular vision of post-EU Britain. The Prime Minister has previously talked about Canada plus beta delta minus. I can't remember the exact the epsilons involved. Just a quick thought from both of you. However we get to that point, whether or not it's via a negotiated exit agreement and then a future relationship, or whether or not we leave and come back to us, when we finally get to that steady state, bluntly, what should our long-term relationship with the European Union look like? Canada, Switzerland, Norway, Botswana, I don't know, pick a country, pick a model.
So if you're going to pick an existing model, and I think...
Or invent one of your own. We could have the Crabb model.
What eventually gets carved out will be a bespoke arrangement for the UK. I think it will probably be more, and what I would like to see is more similar to Canada, but of course there are some big gaps in the Canadian trade agreement, farming, agriculture, for example, and now that doesn't suit our needs very well. I think it's a good thing if we get an agreement with the EU for our high-quality agricultural produce to be carry on exported into EU markets and getting a good price there. My one caveat, and it's a really important one, it's absolutely crucial, is Northern Ireland. And I've taken the view right from the start of all of this that the arrangements that get negotiated and agreed for Great Britain as a whole, you're going to need something different for Northern Ireland. And why? Yes, it's part of the United Kingdom. I have no desire for anything other than it should remain part of the United Kingdom for as long as people in Northern Ireland want it to. But Northern Ireland is already different. It's the only part of, as far as I'm aware, Europe whose constitution is underpinned by an international peace treaty. And I preferred the notion of a Northern Ireland-specific backstop. What eventually made it through into Theresa May's deal was an all-UK backstop, which was, in my view, less good because it provided less freedom for post-Brexit Britain to make decisions about its own economic future. But I'm not in favour of this idea of leaving Northern Ireland back in the EU. That's not what we're talking about. But I think there's an arrangement that could be worked up, maybe over the objections of the DUP, but maybe some arrangements that could be worked up that would actually put Northern Ireland in an incredibly advantageous position, trading into the EU and with its core UK market as well.
That was the Northern Ireland. That was the backstop. No, sorry, I won't make the turn to the backstop now. Anna's now going to answer that and probably dispute the premise of my question and tell us that there is no such thing as a steady state relationship with the EU.
Well, yes, I'll come on to that. I mean, the first thing I'd say is there's an element of dishonesty here because even though the European Union has said all existing third country models are open to the UK, they're not. And they're not simply because we're a closer and a bigger trading partner than any other country with which the European Union has a deal. So the European Union says at press conferences, obviously we're happy to negotiate a Norway-type arrangement with you. They're not. They won't give us what Norway has because we're a competitor to French manufacturing in a way that Norway isn't. So they would hedge that Norway solution for us with all sorts of extra rules because they don't want us competing on what they see as unfair terms. Even with Canada, there is absolutely no prospect of them giving us something more attractive than the Canada deal because we're a damn sight closer to them than Canada is. So they'll say, okay, you can have something that looks like Canada, but you have to hedge it with what they call level playing field conditions about workers' rights, about environmental standards. Why? Because French and Italian manufacturers say, but hang on, if they get to access our market without the same rules as us, they'll undercut us. So actually, our options are far more limited than the European Union has hinted at them being. But we should be clear, again, I mean, one of the economists who was quite prolific during the referendum campaign was a guy from Cardiff called Patrick Minford for Economists for Leave. Now, I have a problem with some of the ways that Patrick uses numbers and some of the assumptions he uses about regulation, but in one way at least he was absolutely scrupulously honest, which was, if we leave the single market and the customs union and do something that looks like Canada but isn't quite as good, which is what he wanted, it will effectively mean the end of manufacturing industry in the United Kingdom. And he was absolutely crystal clear about that. He said this is not what we should be doing as a country. We should be reshaping our economy. And one way to do this is by this break with the European Union, which will mean that essentially BMW in Oxford cannot trade on the same terms as it trades now, because its model of doing business will not work if we have checks. Okay? And he was saying, okay, that is a price worth paying because 20 years down the line we can have a new economy that works better. And that might well be true, but again, there are adaptation costs, not least for those people in Cowley, on the way from where we are now to where we will be then. And yes, as James said, one of the appalling things about being a non-member state next to the European Union geographically, and about the geography we can do nothing, is there is no steady state relationship. The Swiss live a permanent nightmare of ongoing negotiations with the European Union because the European Union's rules keep changing, and as soon as their rules keep changing, they will turn to the country next to them and say, incidentally, as we've decided to adopt all these new regulations, if you want to keep trading with us, we're going to have a chat with you about those regulations as well. So there will be, at a minimum, it might not be on page one of the newspaper every day as it is now, and we all, I think, hope for those days to arrive as soon as possible. But there will be an ongoing set of negotiations with the European Union for as long as it exists and we are not in it.
Thank you. Now, as promised, thoughts from... First hand goes up. Now, I will try and, as a recovering journalist, I have a horror of speeches that are you. So at least pretend to ask a question at the end of your speech, sir. And tell us who you are first.
Thank you. Ian Walker from Sheffield Hallam. The SMF is set up to bring facts to discussions and debates. My question is for Anand, really, and he was saying that one of the facts that may not have been teased out was the economic cost of leaving with no deal. Could you put some figures on that, both in the short term and the long term, please?
Right. Would you do a couple of questions? Back on that side. Thanks, Hannah. And then
Hi, my name is Richard Hislop. I'm from the Falkland Islands government. And it was just really to raise a point that hasn't really been featured in the debate, is that as an overseas territory of the UK, along with all the other overseas territories of the European Union member states, we also have a relationship with the EU via something called the Overseas Association Decision.
Yep.
So we get market access to the European Union. So as a government, we don't question Brexit. If the UK wants to leave, that's entirely up to them. However, because the UK has chosen to leave, if the UK leaves without a deal, we lose that market access.
Yep.
And for us, that's 89% of our fishery exports and a third of all our meat exports.
And your question is,
It's really,
what do we think about that?
Yes, can we think about that and factor that into the debate?
Good. Okay, should we should we do the cost of the cost of, well, can you give us some facts about the cost of leave with no deal? Some absolute categorical economic facts about future GDP numbers.
God, I can't remember. In our no deal report, we use the government's figures, and I think that was 8% of GDP over 15 years in the event of no deal. I can't remember, check it in the report, but let me just say something about this. That's not a fact. There are no facts about the future, okay? And this is one of the areas where the debate got very, very tangled about economic forecasts. First thing to say is that appalling Treasury report commissioned by George Osborne and published in April 2016, which said the day we vote to leave will be followed the next day by X tens of thousands of job losses plus a recession, was obviously wrong. Okay? It wasn't as wrong as people think it is, because actually it turned out to be pretty accurate, but with an 18-month lag. But insofar as it was crystal clear about what it thought would happen on day one, it got the sequencing and the timing wrong. That is economists, and I apologise to any economists here if I sound a bit sniffy about your profession, but I am, doing short-term forecasting. And the problem with doing short-term forecasting is you have to basically predict how people will respond to short-term stimuli in terms of their economic behaviour. And what the Treasury economists thought was, we'll vote to leave, the population will go into meltdown, everyone will start hoarding, no one will shop anymore, because everyone will be terrified of the impact of no-deal Brexit. What in fact happened was we had quite a nice June. We had a European Championship. Loads of people had barbecues and drank a load of beer. And actually consumer spending held its own very, very well indeed. And so that short-term recession simply didn't happen. It is a logical fallacy to jump from saying that was wrong to saying that the long-term implications of changing our trading relationship with the European Union, those forecasts are wrong. It's a bit like my colleague Jonathan Portes puts it this way. The relationship between short and long-term forecasting is a bit like the relationship between the weather and climate. If you turn on the telly in the morning and watch the weather and it says it's not going to rain, well, I can't speak for you, but even if they say that, I would pack an umbrella because I don't believe them, because the weather forecast is very, very unreliable. When I look at climate science, I get a profound sense that over the long term, something odd is happening to climate, because we have decades and decades and decades worth of data and evidence about that. That essentially is the difference between what the Treasury tried to do in April 2016 and what the Treasury has subsequently done about the impact of no deal, which is saying if you put these barriers in place, it will have this impact on our economy. So no one who did a forecast of the long-term impact of Brexit has seen fit to revise those forecasts in the light of what's happened since. So I think these aren't facts, but they're forecasts. They're pretty reliable forecasts. What those forecasts aren't doing is saying this will be the size of our economy 15 years down the line, because we don't know. We might come up with some new technological innovation. These battery investments that the government is planning to make might bear fruit, and Tesla might buy all its batteries from us in 10 years' time. I don't know what's going to happen. What those forecasts are saying is, all things being equal, which is the economist's favourite cop-out line, this will be the impact on our economy compared to if we'd stayed in. And I think those impacts are significant in the event of no deal.
I'm not an economist, but I feel like I should say a word in defence of economics and the Treasury. The April 2016 exercise illustrates the importance of your starting assumptions.
Yeah.
And actually, you could make a defence of that forecast, that if the scenario had played out as the baseline assumption of that forecast suggested, that's probably what the economy would have done.
So if they'd been right, they'd have been
yes,
right.
Exactly. The other one, the cheap way of summing this up is rubbish in, rubbish out.
Yeah.
I mean, the fact, the starting assumptions of that model, in particularly that the Bank of England would not respond to in any way. But in fact, the Bank of England did respond. If you remember, it was actually when the entire UK governing class was paralysed, Mark Carney popped up and said, "Don't worry, everything's going to be okay. I'm going to cut interest rates."
Yeah.
A hugely important
absolutely.
moment, entirely missing from that Treasury model. So, in defence, I say this in defence of economists and the Treasury officials who did what they were told by their political masters. Including you technically at the time, I think. You were technically one of their political masters at the time, I think. So, although we don't hold you responsible. So, Stephen, economic forecast. Have you looked at this on the Brexit subcommittee?
We have, yeah. We've looked at this. I think it's incredibly difficult to put figures on it. Very, very hard. But where people should prick up their ears and listen is when people running individual factories and companies in the UK stand up and say, actually, we've got a problem with no deal for this reason, that reason, that reason. And then they can set out numerous specific, very practical impacts of a no-deal scenario. And for me, I find that more engaging. And the conversations I have with my constituents when they say to me, look, no deal is the only real Brexit, give us our real Brexit, give us no deal. I say, fine, but here are some specific impacts. So I avoid all talking about GDP impacts and things like that, which I think is very, very difficult to kind of nail down with any degree of accuracy, but people understand real impacts on farmers and oil refineries, on car manufacturers and Airbus in North Wales. And the companies that have spoken out and been very honest about these impacts, I think, have been incredibly brave. They've all been criticised at the time for doing it, but they're speaking out for a reason, because every day they provide jobs for people, they understand their businesses better than any politician does, and they understand the rules of the game. And when the rules change so abruptly and so suddenly as they would under a no deal, it would create real problems. I think there's a bit of confusion that sometimes arises when talking about no-deal impacts, and that's the confusion between costs and readiness. And on the Brexit committee, we're spending a lot of time at the moment looking at, are we ready for no deal? And some impressive work is being done and has been done across certain government departments, not all of them by any means. I would absolutely say that the UK is ready for a no-deal scenario far more than it was 6 months ago. I think the pace of preparation over the summer has increased. So, Boris Johnson promised that he would do that. It injects some more energy into that. But when we talk about readiness, it's not the same as saying it will be cost-free. And I think, however ready we are, however you want to define readiness, there will be costs and impacts in a negative way under no deal.
Can I just add something on readiness, because I know there was a gentleman over there who was saying we're ready, and yes, a lot of stuff has been done and an awful lot of money has been spent on readiness. And as Stephen said, our readiness is far greater than it was under the last Prime Minister. But, and it's worth bearing this in mind, full preparations cannot be done just by the British government, because there are three legs to preparations for no deal. One is actions taken by the government. They're important, they're being done. But there are the other two. One of them is readiness by business. the degree to which businesses have prepared themselves for no deal. And in the case of large businesses, I'm pretty confident that, again, a lot of money has been spent and a lot of investments have been made. In the city, they've opened administrative offices within the European Union to allow them to trade. My fear is small businesses, where the Federation of Small Businesses put out some figures last week showing that only a small proportion of small businesses have done what they need to do to continue trading. And that is a concern. And the final leg of this stool is, of course, the European Union. If we wanted to be fully ready to for no deal, the European Union is going to have to help us and help themselves as well. What they've done is they've put in place a whole series of mitigations on things, everything from air transport to freight, to help them and us in the short term. One of my fears about no deal is that politically, after a few months, they will decide to withdraw those, even if it hurts them, because they'll want to turn the screw on us. At that point, we will feel less ready than we did on day one, I think.
There are three people down here who caught my eye. A gentleman there in the front. Sorry, one here, there, there, and there. We'll do three, and then so there's somebody else there, but we'll come to you. So.
Thank you. Sorry for my outburst in agreeing so sincerely with Professor Menon when he said there's a degree of dishonesty, because I think you're right. You've, I think, conflated several things falsely during this debate, during this discussion. You've conflated the not having a stable situation, steady state afterwards with the unstable state that Switzerland is in, which is obviously not analogous. You've conflated not being in the EU in any way, as you said you had your discussion with Mr. Farage, with not having any relationship with the EU in any way, which is a false conflation. You've conflated our need to have a close relationship with the EU.
And the question that arises from your observations is...
Okay, I could keep going on, but I won't.
I fear you could.
You've misunderstood the concept of a BATNA. The concept of a BATNA is the best alternative.
What do you think? Probably going to stop being polite soon.
The question, sorry. The question is, what do you think the best alternative to a negotiated withdrawal agreement is? Remaining in the EU or leaving the EU without a deal?
Good question.
Thank you.
The gentleman here.
Thank you. I'm a business person, small business, in the logistics sector with trucks carrying automotive components into Ford plants in Europe and other plants. So clearly we're going to be affected. Yet I think we should leave the EU. So that's a conflict, isn't it? Stephen made a very important point, I think, that the debate is split into two, political and economic. And it's interesting that most of what we've been talking about is about the economic.
Yes. And
we've avoided the political.
And the question is...
why is it that we're focusing on the economic when most people apparently regard the political as the most important? And let me just say this. When the Czechoslovakian left Soviet Union, Slovakia bid for independence from Czechoslovakia, knowing they would be poorer. And when asked, why on earth did you leave when you know you'd be poorer? The answer was, because we would be free.
Yeah. So, politics versus economics, and the gentleman at the end on the second row there. So,
Northern Ireland border. What is your opinion on this statement? The EU could agree to some method of handling the border, a soft border, of course. It's just a matter of attitude that they are not prepared to discuss the subject.
Thank you.
As a rider, I have a friend business colleague, who deals with cross-border trade, and he said, give me the job, I'll get it done. It may not be perfect, there will be leakage, there's always leakage across borders, and in the short term, maybe a bit rough, we'll get better.
Sure. My quick summary of those three questions was, what is your preferred alternative to a deal? Why has the economic dimension of this conversation trumped at what I suppose economics would call the elite level, trumped the political, the values-based questions about the non-economic case for leaving, and essentially could the EU approach the Northern Ireland border question differently, and are they just making a fuss about the border as a negotiating ploy?
Shall I go first on those?
Yeah.
Yeah, so in a situation at the end of this month, if you were to ask me what do I prefer, not leaving, or leaving without a deal, or sorry, what was your question?
Well, it's important not to conflate
Yes.
again leaving without a deal and never having a deal, and all sorts of other things which we've been skipping over and being a bit clumsy.
But your final question
What is your
crystallised
best
it.
alternative to a negotiated agreement?
So
So
if we fail to get an agreement in the coming weeks, I'm with Boris now on this, that we have to go through that deadline, that barrier, if Parliament hasn't tied it so far up in knots that makes it impossible. Because, as I was saying in my opening remarks, the sense of injustice in the country for those people who feel that their vote is being deliberately devalued, ignored and overlooked. That the politics, the values, if you want to call it that, trump the economics. But as I said in my opening remarks, that is not a steady state. We will be back round the table having to work out whether it's side agreements, whether it's an overarching trade agreement, an association agreement in the years ahead. We will need to pin down what our long-term relationship with the EU will be.
And that will happen regardless of whether or not we have a withdrawal agreement, correct?
We'll have to negotiate an agreement.
But the substance of the withdrawal agreement doesn't go away.
So in a sense, you've argued for the first. You answered the first and second questions there, and that you've given us your best alternative, and you've said that in that case, the political considerations should trump the economic arguments. And any thoughts on Northern Ireland? Are they, is the Republic of Ireland, are the EU
So I don't agree
using
with
the
the
border as a
question.
ploy?
I don't agree with the question to an extent. There is you're absolutely right in that the EU are not making this easy for us, but their concerns about the Northern Ireland, they're not just using it as a bit of trickery here, and neither is the Irish government, by the way. There's two sets of concerns. For the Irish government and people who live close to the border, it's about Good Friday Agreement and any change to the status quo, where people can move across that border. People who live on the north can identify themselves very much as Irish. They move freely, they do business across the border. And people there don't want any change to that. They don't want any change at all to that. For the EU, their concerns are about exactly the point, you talk about leakage, there'll always be leakage. Well, they are worried about leakage because that border will become the new economic frontier between the United Kingdom and the EU. And they're under pressure from other member states to make sure that that is a tight border, that it won't become a soft backdoor for products not abiding by EU standards and therefore contaminating the single market. That's where their concerns lie. And so
it's a legitimate concern, not a negotiating ploy. Right, Anand, if you can answer all those questions in 30 words or fewer, we can get on to one last round of questions. So.
You're going to love this. My best alternative would be to delay if we haven't got a deal.
Okay.
Can I just give you one reason apart from the EU reason, which is it fills me with terror that we might try and ram the withdrawal agreement bill through Parliament in 3 sitting days, because it is a massive piece of constitutional legislation that deserves to be considered properly. And if for no other reason, not delaying as a matter partly of party politics would, I think, not be the best way forward.
That means remaining in?
No, that means delaying.
Albeit temporarily.
Temporarily, yeah.
Okay.
On the politics economics trade-off, I share your frustration in a way. I mean, one of the things that irritates me greatly is if a sort of professional middle-class person says, oh, I'm going to vote for a party that taxes me more because I want a fairer society, you're considered virtuous. If you say, I'd like to leave the European Union, I don't care if it makes me poor, you're considered stupid. And actually, politics can trump economics for everyone. And it is absolutely fair enough. What I would say, though, is politics and economics are interrelated. We about a few months ago, we dug up the polling from, and if you remember back in 2000, there was a refinery blockades, and we nearly ran out of petrol. 3 days before those blockades started, remember we didn't run out of petrol, there was just the promise of some disruption. 3 days before those blockades started, Labour were polling at 49% and were almost 20 points clear of the Conservatives. 3 days after the blockades was the only day in that Parliament where the Tories had a lead over Labour. So there is an interrelationship between politics and economics, and part of this is going to be a gamble over whether you think electorally the disruption that will come from no deal, whether you think it's put upable with or not is up to you, but whether you think the public will react to that in a way that affects the polling. On Northern Ireland, I would say, firstly, there is no other border that does this, and if the gentleman's friend who said they could do this, I'd have thought he'd have done it in Canada or in Norway by now anyway. So the first question is, why hasn't he done so? And the second is, we say leakage, the French and Italians say anti-competitive competition, unfair competition. What they say is stuff getting onto our market that hasn't paid the same tariffs from China or whatever. And the example I will give you, I don't think the position of the Irish government is as sort of unpolitical as is claimed. I think it's a bit odd that their preferences seem to be the backstop, no deal, and a time-limited backstop. And that's partly because the Taoiseach has tied himself in with politics and isn't thinking about the economic impact. But the example I will give you is Ukraine, and it's a very interesting and salutary example. When Poland joined the European Union, there was virtually no border between the east of Poland and the west of Ukraine, and consequently the west of Ukraine did very, very well economically. And the Poles, when they came in, begged the European Union, saying, look, you will damage eastern Poland, you will damage western Ukraine by sticking up a hard border. And do you know what the EU did? They said, screw you, and they stuck up a hard border, because it was the external border of the European Union, and that was that. And I suspect that what will happen in Ireland in the event of a no deal will look very similar to that.
Now we'll try and do one last round of questions. One hand there, one there, and one there. So, lady there, gentleman there, and the last question to that gentleman in the glasses there.
So my name's Katie, I'm with the British Irish Chamber of Commerce, and as an organisation we're very much in favour of a negotiated exit. It's what our members want. But my question is there any deal now that could be agreed between the UK and the EU that will actually get the support needed in Parliament, given the actual current state of play within Westminster? There's going to be people who will just vote against it.
Can any deal pass the Parliament?
Can any deal actually get through?
Therefore, is there any reason for the EU to make the concession?
Yeah, and that is the other concern, because obviously any change from the withdrawal agreement as it is will require concessions from the EU. And the EU is probably going to be reluctant to do that if there is no chance of it getting passed.
So the gentleman there.
Do we not think the language we use about us being poorer, it's a bit misleading? No long-term economist has actually said that we're going to be poorer. We're always going to be richer. We're just going to be
poorer than we might have been otherwise.
But just on that point, you could make a perfectly good argument for Canada to join the USA. It could get rid of its customs. It could have the same regulation, have the same single currency. It could have access to another 50 states. You could argue it could be 8% richer. You could argue that Canada is permanently making itself poorer. But the Canadians wouldn't have it any other way. So I think the language about it is completely misleading to say that we're going to be poorer. We're not going to have any less money than we have.
Good question. And the gentleman on...
Hi. David Roberts, Mill Valley Conservatives. Do you think that the constant waffle from Project Fear over the last 3 years has actually pushed people towards no deal because it's not addressing the political issue and it's only addressing the economic issue?
So, prospects of deal passing Parliament is the language in which we discuss future economic gains foregone, misleading, and have the warnings of future economic growth foregone actually crystallised and hardened public opinion against a deal? Who wants to go first?
Yeah. I think it's more just frustration with what we're seeing as the complete and utter lack of progress in Parliament has pushed people towards the polls. So we're getting a debate now that seems to be between revoke and no deal, with the centre ground completely missing. I think that's just that people are fed up. They're just, both sides are saying just get it done. What they mean by get it done is polar opposites, but I think that's what's going on. On the Canadians, yeah, it's a good question. I suppose the more analogous question would be, why doesn't Texas leave the US? Because it is moving from the status quo. I mean, that's the issue is about no deal. It's the disruption of moving from this model to that model. Which will hit people and their lives and their livelihoods. It's not about, so it's slightly different to the Canadian thing about why don't they join. It's, we are in a situation now, we are going to disrupt it, but there are perfectly legitimate political reasons for wanting to disrupt it. But we should just bear those in mind. On poorer, what I would say is, according to the forecast, under Mrs May's deal, the economy would have continued growing year on year, despite the impact of Brexit. That's not necessarily the case for the forecasts of no deal. That is to say, the forecasts with no deal are forecasting at least short-term recession. So in terms of year-on-year growth, that's slightly different. Yeah, no, absolutely. And it depends on a whole load of other things as well. What happens to the economy, how productive we are, all sorts of other things could affect that. But all I'm saying is there are differences in scale in terms of the impact. Can any deal pass this Parliament now? No. I don't think.
That's clear. Good.
So I'm not as absolutist in saying that there's no deal that could pass through Parliament. I think if the possibility is tiny, and it certainly felt like that at the end of last week, given how noisy and messy it was in the House of Commons. I mean, I've spoken to Boris about this and Michael Gove in the last couple of weeks, and both of them say, very candidly, it appears to me, that they can see a landing zone for a revised deal. Now, whether that's a landing zone that's also in the view of the Irish government and the EU, I don't know. I do take it on good faith that the discussions are real. I spoke to one of your Irish ministers last week, and he says the discussions are very real and there's movement, but he was also saying the movement is nowhere near enough to overcome the concerns that Irish government have and the EU have. So, tall order, but I wouldn't rule it out completely. The discussion about Slovakia and Canada and being poor is very interesting. The Slovakian example, wanted independence and knew that they would take an economic hit. They've also joined the EU, of course, so they don't see any problem in sharing decision-making, being part of multilateral decision-making, pooling sovereignty, if you want to use any of those kind of buzz phrases. And I guess one observation that's worth making is all of that language, which, those of us who did politics and economics at university 30 years ago were kind of reared on that. That has so little traction now. When you try to explain to people actually being part of the EU, and this is what we tried to do in 2016 during the referendum campaign, being part of the EU, you share in decision-making, you're not being ruled over by a foreign entity. People don't believe that now on the doorsteps. They believe in a very raw way we have been subjugated to foreign rule and want to be free from this. And that's where the politics has got. And the hollow ground, the centre ground has been hollowed out to that extent. On the poorer argument, I agree largely with James. It's about being poorer than you otherwise would have been. The caveat to that is, look, there are some communities where, and my own in West Wales, where we have certain industries there where what kind of Brexit we get really matters to that industry. And if that industry was to disappear, and some of these old industrial things do come and go, and it would leave my community very much poorer. Not just in relative terms, but the loss of those kind of jobs that pay well would hurt my community. So that is why one of the reasons why I'm so keen to get some kind of arrangement in place. But even when, I make the point yet again, when I talk to my constituents, even those whose own livelihoods are affected by the kind of industry we have, they still say, get this done. They want Brexit done.
Thank you. Now, we're slightly over time, for which I apologise. We'll wrap up there. Before I thank our panellists, can I just go back to our audience participation exercise at the beginning? It's a massive exercise of naivety and optimism in my case. Has anybody changed their minds about the need for a deal since the start of the session?
Depends on the deal.
Or a deal?
Well, anyway, essentially, has anybody who didn't raise their hand earlier on, would they do so now? Has anyone changed their mind? Good, we've catastrophically, we've utterly failed. Good, that's a good start to the day. On which note, I will say thank you very much to Stephen Crabb, thank you very much to Anand Menon, UK Change Europe, and thank you all for coming. Have a nice conference. Thank you.